The auctioneer said the words twice because he could not believe them the first time. Sold. $10, Hamilton County Armory. To the gentleman in the wool coat. There were 7 people in the surplus lot office that Tuesday morning, and none of them clapped. 3 of them laughed. One of them, a young clerk with a clipboard, tried not to look at the old man shaking hands as he counted out 10 $1 bills onto the counter, smoothed each bill flat, and slid them across. Beside him, a woman in a light grey cardigan over a floral dress kept her chin up. Her white hair was pinned back. She was holding 2 suitcases, one brown leather with a brass clasp older than the clerk, one blue with a Navy Nurse Corps sticker peeling near the handle. The suitcases were, if anyone had thought to lift them, almost weightless. They contained, between them, a folded photograph, a purple heart in a velvet box, 6 letters bound in a red rubber band, a change of underclothes for 2, and nothing else. "Congratulations," the clerk said quietly. "You just bought a condemned building." Harold Vance touched the brim of his cap. "No, son," he said. "We just bought a home." Outside the office window, through the chain-link fence, the armory stood the way it had stood for 111 years. Corrugated metal streaked with rust, ivy climbing through the broken windows, the raised letters above the door still legible if you knew where to look. Hamilton County Armory, established 1912. Ruth Vance set the suitcases down on the cracked asphalt and put her arm around her husband's waist. He put his arm around her shoulders. They stood like that for a long moment, backs to the road, facing the ruin. Anyone driving past would have seen exactly what the ruse was designed to make them see. 2 old people, abandoned, with nowhere to go, standing in front of the only shelter $10 could buy. That is what the town of Cicero, Indiana would say for the next 3 days. That is what Wallace Vance would tell his wife when the county clerk, an old friend of his mother's, called him just before lunch. That is what the daughter-in-law would say on the phone at 12:41 that afternoon, in a call she did not know was being recorded from the other end. What none of them knew, what Harold's eldest son in particular did not know, was that the brown leather suitcase had a false lining, and inside that lining was a legal pad page in Harold's careful block printing, folded 3 times, titled at the top with 2 underlined words. Operation Order. In 72 hours, Harold and Ruth Vance would know exactly which of their 3 surviving children still saw them as parents, and which one saw them as a signature on a deed. But to understand why 2 decorated veterans would stand in front of a rusted armory with 2 empty suitcases and let the world believe they have lost everything, you have to go back 3 weeks. You have to go back to the phone call Ruth was never supposed to hear. And you have to go back further still, to a letter written in 2003 by a young man in a valley in Afghanistan. A letter that ended with a sentence his mother had never been able to read aloud, and would finally, at the age of 71, obey. Ruth Vance kept a notebook. She had kept one for 48 years, since the surgical wards on the USNS Comfort, where a nurse who did not write down what did not sit right could kill a patient by Friday. The notebook that autumn was a green field notes she had bought at the farm supply store, and by mid-October she had filled 31 pages of it with things that did not sit right about her eldest son. Wallace calling 4 times in 2 weeks, after not calling for 8 months. Wallace bringing Marla to Sunday dinner, and Marla walking through every room of the house with a phone held out at chest height. Wallace asking, casually, whether the farmhouse was still in Harold's name alone or whether Ruth had ever been added. Wallace laughing when Harold said the pension arrears had finally come through. Marla asking, twice, whether they had considered how much upkeep the farm required at their age. On the afternoon of October 3rd, Ruth walked through the mudroom in her sock feet and heard Marla in the kitchen, on speaker, talking to a woman named Denise. She did not know it then, but the woman was Marla's cousin, she heard Marla say. We can have them warehoused by Thanksgiving, if Wallace stops dragging his feet. She heard the woman named Denise say, $2,800 a month per head. Cash, no questions. They sign what you put in front of them. She heard Marla laugh and say, they will sign. He is slipping. She will do whatever he tells her. Ruth stood in her sock feet in the mudroom and did not breathe for a count of 11. She turned around. She walked back out through the side door. She went to the barn where Harold was oiling the hinges on a stall gate that no horse had used in 20 years. And she said, very quietly, "Harold, I need you to sit down." She told him what she had heard. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Get me the shoebox." The shoebox was under their bed. It had held a pair of Ruth's white nursing shoes in 1974. It now held 6 letters, tied with a red rubber band, and a purple heart in a velvet-lined box, and a folded photograph of a boy in dress uniform who would not turn 25. Harold untied the red rubber band. He did not open the top letter. He set his hand flat on it and closed his eyes and said, "Ruthie, do you remember what Danny told us?" The letter was dated August 11th, 2003. Daniel had written, "Mom, Dad, you always said the measure of a person is what they do when nobody is looking. Out here, I have learned it is simpler than that. The measure of a person is what they do when they think you cannot help them anymore. That is the whole test. If somebody still shows up for you when you have got nothing left to give, that is family. Everything else is just paperwork." Ruth closed the notebook. She said, "Harold." He was 23 years old when he wrote that. Harold said, and he was right. They did not sleep that night. At 3 in the morning, Harold went to his desk and began on a yellow legal pad, in the block printing he had used for after-action reports for 42 years, to write the first draft of what he would eventually title, at the top of the 3rd page, Operation Order. The decision to test their own children was not made quickly, and it was not made cleanly. There is no clean way to make it. Ruth argued, for 2 days, that they should confront Wallace directly. Harold argued that they had confronted Wallace directly in 1998 about a check that had gone missing from Ruth's purse. And Wallace had cried and denied it, and been believed, and 6 months later Ruth had found the cashed check in a drawer in Wallace's old bedroom. Harold said, "We asked him then. He lied. What makes you think he will not lie again, only bigger?" Ruth said, "He is our son." Harold said, "So was Danny." And Danny told us how to know. The human contradiction of Harold Vance, aged 74, sitting at a kitchen table at 3 in the morning designing a trap for his own child, is the contradiction that had to be carried. He was not a suspicious man. He had been, all his life, almost unbearably trusting. He had shaken hands with a private contractor in 1991 on the sale of a truck, and lost $800 because the man's word was not his bond, and Harold had not thought to ask for it in writing. He had never once locked the farmhouse door. He was not by nature the kind of man who set traps. But Daniel had said what he said, and Ruth's notebook had 31 pages, and the woman named Denise had said $2,800 a month per head. Cash, no questions. The morning of October 6th, Ruth came into the kitchen and found Harold at the table with the legal pad in front of him and a mug of coffee gone cold, and Miller the shepherd asleep on his boots. She sat down across from him. She read what he had written. She took the pen from him. She added 2 lines at the bottom, in her own handwriting, and slid the pad back. The lines she added were, 1. We do not lie about anything that matters. 2. If they pass, we tell them everything and we ask their forgiveness for doubting them. Harold read them. He nodded once. He signed his name at the bottom. She signed hers underneath. That was the moment the ruse began. The operation order had 4 parts, and it had taken Harold 11 days to finalize. Part 1 was the cover story. They would tell no active lie. They would let a set of true, small facts be misread. They would say truthfully that the farmhouse had become too much. They would say truthfully that they were considering a change. They would sign nothing. They would let Wallace and Marla assume and act on what they wanted to assume. Ruth's second rule made this the only permissible approach. Part 2 was the property. For 2 years, Harold had been quietly corresponding with the county surplus office about the old Armory on Ridge Road. He had grown up half a mile from it. He had drilled in it in 1968 before shipping to Vietnam. In September, when the pension arrears, $71,400, delayed 19 months by a paperwork error at the VA, finally cleared his account. He had made the surplus office a standing offer. Whenever the county was ready to unload the armory, at the minimum statutory bid, he would take it. The clerk had called on September 29th. The auction was scheduled for October 24th at 10 in the morning. Minimum bid, $10. Nobody else would bid. Nobody else wanted a condemned building with an asbestos remediation clause. Part 3 was the surveillance. Ruth had ordered, from a legitimate hobbyist site, a pinhole camera set into a costume jewelry poppy pin. Retail price $180. Storage, 8 hours. Harold's flip-style phone, replacing the smartphone Marla had helpfully set up for him in August, had a one-touch call recording feature. Indiana is a one-party consent state, and both Harold and Ruth had researched this before committing to a single recording. A motion-activated wildlife camera, previously used to watch the raccoons in the corn crib, was moved into the farmhouse mudroom, mounted inside an old coffee tin on a shelf, angled at the back door and the kitchen entryway. A locked safety deposit box at First Farmers Bank held the original deed to the farmhouse, the real balance of their savings, $214,880, most of it in laddered certificates of deposit. Harold's original DD Form 214, and a second copy of the operation order. Part 4 was the timeline. On October 24th, at 10 in the morning, they would purchase the armory in a public auction that the county clerk, a longtime friend of Ruth's, would ensure Wallace heard about within the hour. They would return to the farmhouse, only long enough to be seen packing. They would take 2 suitcases, empty of anything but the letters and the Purple Heart, and 1 change of clothes. They would drive the pickup to the armory. They would sit on the loading dock with the suitcases in front of them. They would wait. Whoever came, and how they came, and what they said when they got there, would be the test. They would give the children 72 hours. The night before deployment, Harold read the operation order aloud to Ruth. He said, "Mission, to determine before the enemy is inside our house, which of our children is the enemy. Method, give each of them the chance to be the son or daughter Danny would have wanted them to be. End state, we know." Ruth said, "Harold, Danny would not have written it like that." Harold said, "Danny was 24. I am 74. He would have grown into it." The auction ran 9 minutes. The armory was lot 14 of 19, and by the time it came up, half the folding chairs in the surplus office were empty because the day's real business, a fleet of decommissioned pickups, had been auctioned in the first hour. Harold stood when his lot was called. The clerk read the description in the flat voice of someone who had read the same description at 7 prior auctions, and had never had a bidder. Hamilton County Armory, constructed 1912, decommissioned 1994, condemned 2011. Structure includes drill floor, 2 motor bays, 1 ordnance storage room, 1 administrative wing. Site includes 1.4 acres, chain link perimeter, cracked asphalt lot. Buyer accepts asbestos remediation clause and environmental assessment obligation. Minimum bid, $10. Harold raised his hand. The auctioneer, whose name was Merle Petty, and who had known Harold since 1962, looked at him over the top of his reading glasses. "Harold," he said, off the gavel, quiet. "You sure?" "I am sure, Merle." $10, going once. Going twice. Merle waited a full 3 seconds, watching the room, giving anyone who might have arrived late a chance to save Harold from himself. Nobody moved. Sold. $10. Hamilton County Armory. To the gentleman in the wool coat. Ruth counted the bills. Harold signed the transfer. The county clerk, a woman named Ellen Marchetti, who had gone to high school with Ruth, and who knew the whole of the operation order because Ruth had told her the previous Thursday over coffee, notarized the deed with a hand that trembled only slightly. She stamped it. She looked up. She said, "You want me to make that call now, Ruth?" Ruth said, "Give it 40 minutes. Let us get to the property first." They walked out. Ruth carried the suitcases. Harold carried the deed in a manila envelope. Miller followed at Harold's left heel. They loaded the truck. They drove the 2 miles to the armory. They parked on the cracked asphalt. Ruth opened the pinhole camera and slid the poppy pin onto her cardigan just above her heart. Harold set the 2 suitcases on the ground in front of them. They stood in front of the ruin, backs to the road, and they waited. At 10:53 in the morning, 39 minutes after the deed was stamped, Ellen Marchetti dialed a phone number she had scribbled on a sticky note. It was Wallace Vance's direct office line at Peninsula Financial Group in Indianapolis. She had known Wallace since he was in a car seat, she said, in a voice pitched exactly at concerned neighborly gossip. Wallace, honey, I do not know if I am out of line calling you, but your daddy just did something I think you ought to know about. He and your mama came in here and bought that old armory on Ridge Road for $10. And they had 2 suitcases with them, Wallace. They had 2 suitcases in the truck. She listened for 6 seconds. She said, well, honey, I am just telling you what I saw. I thought somebody in the family ought to know. She hung up. At 10:54, Wallace Vance called his wife Marla. At 10:58, Marla Vance called her cousin Denise. At 11:11, Wallace Vance did not call his father, did not drive north. He called his sister Bethany in Bloomington and told her, in a tone of great weary concern, that their parents had just done something very worrying, and that the family was going to need to have a conversation about next steps, and that she should keep her phone on. Bethany asked, one question, are they okay right now? Right this minute, Wallace said he did not know. Bethany hung up. Bethany did not call back. Bethany got in her car. The first result of the test was not a door. The first result was the fact that at 11:47 in the morning, 1 hour and 34 minutes after the auction closed, Harold and Ruth Vance were still standing in front of the armory, and the only person who had come was a stranger. He was a man in his early 60s, driving a battered green Ford. He slowed at the gate. He rolled down his window. He said, "You folks all right out there?" Harold said, "We are, thank you," the man said. "You need water. You need me to call somebody." Harold said, "We are fine. This is our property." The man looked at the armory. He looked at the suitcases. He looked at Ruth. He said, "Ma'am, if you need anything, I am 2 miles down at the Sunoco. My name is Ray." He nodded once. He drove on. Ruth wrote, "Ray Sunoco, green Ford," in the notebook. She said, "Harold." A stranger stopped. Harold said, "I know." They sat down on the loading dock. Ruth opened the thermos. They drank coffee. Miller lay across Harold's boots. The sky was the color of pewter, and the ivy on the armory moved in the wind like something breathing. Ruth checked her watch. It was 12:03, she said. "He knows by now," Harold said. "He has known for an hour and 10 minutes. At 12:41 in the afternoon, 2 hours and 31 minutes after the auction closed, and 150 miles of highway from any door Wallace Vance would have to knock on to reach them, Harold's flip phone rang. The screen said Wallace. Harold looked at Ruth. Ruth said, "Record it." Harold pressed the record button. He answered. Wallace said, Dad, listen. Ellen Marchetti called me." "What is going on?" Harold said. "Your mother and I bought a building, son," Wallace said. "You, Dad. Dad, you bought a condemned armory for $10. "With suitcases in the truck," Harold said. "That is right." Wallace said, "Dad, where are you sleeping tonight?" Harold paused. He said, "We will figure it out, son." Wallace said, "Dad, this is exactly what Marla and I have been worried about. This is exactly the kind of decision we have been talking about. Dad, listen, I need you to sit tight. I need you not to sign anything else. Marla and I are going to come up this weekend, and we are going to sit down as a family, and we are going to make a plan. Okay, do not sign anything, Dad. Do not talk to anybody about the farmhouse. Do you understand?" Harold said, "I understand." Wallace said, "Where is Mum?" Harold said, "She is right here," Wallace said. "Is she okay?" "Is she, Dad? Has she been eating?" Marla said last Sunday she looked thin. Harold said, "Your mother is fine, son." Wallace said, "This weekend, Dad. Saturday. We will be up Saturday. Do not do anything until then. I love you, Dad." Wallace hung up. It was Tuesday, Ruth wrote in the notebook. Wallace called at 12:41. Duration 3 minutes 14 seconds. Did not ask where we are. Did not ask if we are safe. Told us not to sign anything. Told us not to talk to anyone about the farmhouse. Coming Saturday, she underlined Saturday. Harold said, 4 days. Ruth said, 4 days to get us to sign whatever he is bringing with him. At 1:14 in the afternoon, Harold's phone rang again. The screen said Bethany. Harold answered. He did not press record. Ruth watched his face, and afterward she would write in the notebook that she saw, for the first time since October 3rd, her husband's jaw unclench. Bethany did not say hello. Bethany said, Daddy, where are you? Harold said, Ridge Road, honey. The old Armory, Bethany said. I am 90 minutes out. I have blankets and I have the space heater from the clinic. And I have my mother's floral quilt from my linen closet. And I have a thermos of that stew Mum likes. Daddy, do not move. Do you hear me? Do not move. I am coming. Harold said, honey. It is a 2-hour drive. Bethany said, I will be there in 90 minutes. She hung up. Ruth was looking at Harold. Harold was looking at the ivy on the Armory, and his eyes were wet, and Ruth wrote in the notebook, Bethany did not ask about the farmhouse. Bethany did not ask what we were doing. Bethany asked where we were. She closed the notebook. She said, Harold, there is one thing that does not sit right. Harold said, tell me, Ruth said. Wallace told us not to talk to anybody about the farmhouse. Why the farmhouse? Why did he say the farmhouse and not the Armory, and not our savings, and not our health? He said the farmhouse, Harold said. He said it because that is what he is already thinking about. Ruth said, he said it because he has already moved on it. They looked at each other on the loading dock. A gust of wind came through the ivy, and one of the broken windows of the Armory sighed. Miller lifted his head. In the distance, past the chain link, a semi shifted gears on the highway. Harold said, Ruthie. When we get home tonight, I want to check the mudroom camera. Ruth said, we are going home tonight. Harold said, we were always going home tonight. We just were not going to tell them. The mudroom camera, unwatched now for 6 days, was sitting inside an old coffee tin on a shelf in the back of the Vance farmhouse. Its motion sensor had tripped at 3:52 in the morning on the previous Thursday, and again on Sunday afternoon, and again on Monday at night 11 at night. 3 recordings, none of them yet reviewed. Daniel had written, on May the 4th, 2003, Bethany still owes me $12 from that pool game in Terre Haute in 2001, and I want it on the record, in writing, that when I get home I am collecting. Also on the record, she is the only one of us who called Mom every Sunday when I was at Bragg. I am not saying anything about anybody. I am saying that. At 2:38 in the afternoon, a red Subaru with a Bloomington Veterinary Associates decal on the rear window came up Ridge Road too fast, braked, corrected, and pulled through the Armory gate. Bethany Vance Ortiz got out, and she was already crying before she closed the door. She did not say hello, she did not ask what was going on. She crossed the asphalt in 8 strides, and she put her arms around her mother, and she said into Ruth's hair, Mama, Mama, Mama. Ruth was, for the first time since the phone call on October 3rd, undone. She held her daughter and she shook. Bethany pulled back. She held her mother at arm's length. She looked at Harold. She said, Daddy, what happened? Talk to me. Harold, whose operation order required that they not lie about anything that mattered, said, Honey, sit down. They sat on the loading dock. Bethany had brought the thermos of stew, and she opened it and she put it in her mother's hands, and she wrapped her mother's hands around it, and she said, Eat, Mama, eat first. Talk after. Ruth ate, Harold ate. Bethany did not eat. Bethany talked. She said Wallace called me at 11. He said you had bought a building. He said you had suitcases. He said the family needed to have a conversation. Daddy, I have been driving for 92 minutes, and I have been going through every conversation I have had with Wallace this year. And I have to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Has Wallace been talking to you about the farmhouse? Harold said yes. Bethany said, Has Marla been in the house? Harold said she has been in the house 4 times since August. Bethany closed her eyes. She said, Daddy, in August, Wallace called me and asked me if I thought you and Mum were, quote, still competent to make major decisions. Ruth stopped chewing. Bethany said, "I told him you were both sharper than he is. He got angry. He hung up. He has not called me since." She looked at the armory. She looked at the suitcases. She looked at her father in his wool coat, and her mother in her cardigan, and she said, in a voice so quiet, the pinhole camera almost lost it, "You are not homeless, Daddy, are you?" Harold said, "No, honey, we are not." Bethany said, "You are testing him." Harold said, "We are testing all of you." Bethany did not cry then. Bethany did something the operation order had not anticipated. Bethany laughed, one hard, surprised, wet laugh, and she said, "Oh, Daddy. Oh, Daddy, of course you are." And then she said, "Okay, tell me the plan. What do you need me to do?" Ruth wrote in the notebook at 3:04, Bethany. Passed. She did not underline it. She circled it twice. Harold decided that Bethany would be told everything. The pin, the phone, the mudroom camera, the safety deposit box. She would be, from this moment forward, an operational partner. But she would also, per the operation order's first rule, drive back to Bloomington that night as if nothing had changed, so that Wallace did not know she knew. At 6:19, in the evening, Bethany's red Subaru pulled back out of the gate. Before she left, she took her mother's face in both hands and she said, "Mama, I do not care what he has done. I do not care what any of them have done. I am not going anywhere." She looked at Harold. She said, "Daddy, Danny would have driven up faster than I did." Harold said, "Danny would have driven up first, honey, but you drove up, and that counts." At 9:11 that night, Harold sat down at the farmhouse kitchen table with the memory card from the mudroom coffee tin camera and a laptop, and he opened the folder marked with the previous Thursday's date, 3:52 in the morning. Daniel had written on June the 22nd, 2003, "You always want to know what somebody is capable of. Do not watch them at Christmas. Watch them at 3 in the morning. Christmas is a costume. 3 in the morning is who you are." Harold pressed play at 9:17 at night. The mudroom camera was mounted inside a coffee tin on the top shelf, angled through a nail hole Harold had drilled the previous month. The footage was in black and white and grainy, and there was no audio. It ran on a motion trigger. The timestamp in the corner said 3:52 and 14 seconds. Thursday, October 19th. For the first 8 seconds nothing moved. The mudroom was empty. Ruth's boots by the door, Harold's coat on the hook, Miller's water bowl. At 3:52 and 22 seconds, the back door opened. Marla Vance came in first. She was wearing a knee-length coat over a set of dark clothing. She was carrying a large canvas bag. She had a small flashlight in her mouth. She closed the door behind her very carefully, using both hands, so that it did not click. She took the flashlight out of her mouth. She turned toward the kitchen. She waited. The back door opened again. Wallace Vance came in. He was carrying a manila folder and a laptop bag. They did not speak. Ruth, standing behind Harold in the kitchen, put her hand on the back of his chair. Harold did not move. Marla and Wallace walked out of frame into the kitchen. The camera lost them. For 11 minutes the footage held on an empty mudroom. Miller could be heard, once, whining from upstairs. Harold's back stiffened. At 4:03 and 41 seconds they came back into frame. Marla was carrying the canvas bag, and it was heavier now. She was carrying it with 2 hands. Wallace was carrying a small stack of papers and a shoebox. Ruth made a sound. The shoebox was the shoebox with Daniel's letters. Wallace was carrying the shoebox with Daniel's letters, and he was walking through his parents' mudroom at 4 in the morning, and he was taking it toward the door. Marla said something to him. He shook his head. He set the shoebox down on the bench by the door. He opened it. He took out the top letter. He photographed it with his phone. He photographed the second letter. He photographed all 6 letters. He put them back in the box. He put the box back in the canvas bag. Marla shook her head. Wallace took the shoebox back out of the bag. He set it on the bench. He and Marla left. The door closed behind them at 4:07 and 58 seconds. The footage ended. Harold sat very still. Ruth sat down in the chair beside him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Ruth said finally, Why would he photograph Danny's letters? Harold said he would not. Marla would. Ruth said, why would Marla photograph Danny's letters? Harold said. Because if she can prove I am not of sound mind, and she can prove I have been talking to a dead son for 22 years, she can prove I need a guardian. Ruth was very quiet. She said, Harold, I want you to open the folder from Sunday. The Sunday footage was 3 minutes and 11 seconds long. It was daytime. It was Marla alone in the kitchen. She was going through the drawer where Ruth kept the tax returns. She was photographing each page. She was working from a list on her phone. She looked up, once, directly at the coffee tin. And Ruth would later say that the moment when Marla looked directly at the hidden camera and did not see it was the moment Ruth stopped feeling sorry for her. The Monday footage was 47 seconds long. It was Wallace, alone, in the mudroom. He was hanging a spare key on the hook by the back door. It was not their spare key. It was a key he had brought with him. He was giving somebody else access to the farmhouse. Harold decides to call Sheriff Ada Boone in the morning. He read aloud from the operation order. End state, we know. Subparagraph, we know what to do about it. The key stayed on the hook. Neither Harold nor Ruth touched it, so that whoever Wallace gave the copy to did not know that they had been seen. Daniel had written on July the 3rd, 2003, there are two kinds of paperwork in the army. The kind that keeps you alive, and the kind that gets you killed. There is no difference in how they look. The only way to tell is who is asking you to sign, and how much they want it, and whether they let you read it first. Sheriff Ada Boone was 51 years old, and she had been a military police corporal under First Sergeant Harold Vance, in Germany, from 1996 to 1998. She had sworn, at his retirement dinner in 2001, that if he ever needed anything, she owed him a favor she had not yet paid. She had not seen him in 11 years. At 7:14 in the morning, Wednesday, she was standing in the Vance kitchen with a mug of coffee in her hand, watching the mudroom footage on Harold's laptop. She watched it twice. When it ended the second time, she set the mud down on the counter and she said, one word, quietly, okay. She said, Harold, you have here what looks like unlawful entry, elder financial exploitation in the pre-act stage, and evidence of a plan to alter or forge legal documents. If you want a warrant on your son, I have enough to get one from Judge Emerson by noon. Harold said, I do not want a warrant yet. Ada said, what do you want? Harold said, I want him to hang himself. Ada said, legally speaking, Harold said, I want him to say in his own voice, on a recording, exactly what he thinks he is doing. Then I want you. Ada said, do you have his phone number? Ruth said, I have his direct office line, Ada said. Indiana is a one-party consent state. If Harold makes the call, or Ruth makes the call, either of you can record it without telling him. And if Wallace names the property, names the buyer, names the placement facility, or names the guardian arrangement, any one of those four, I have enough to bring the State Elder Fraud Unit in this afternoon. Ruth said, I will make the call. Ada said, Ma'am, are you sure? Ruth said, he is my son. If somebody is going to make him say it out loud, it should be me. At 9:41 in the morning Wednesday, Ruth Vance dialed her son's direct office line. Harold pressed record. Ada Boone sat at the kitchen table with her notebook open. Bethany, who had driven back up at 6 in the morning, sat with her hand on her mother's forearm. Ruth said, Wallace, honey. Wallace said, Mom, are you okay? Where are you? Ruth said. I am at the farmhouse, honey. Bethany drove us home last night. We slept in our own bed. Wallace paused. He said, Mom, you should not have done that. That house is not safe for you two right now. Ruth said. Why is it not, honey? Wallace said. Mom, because of Dad. Dad is making decisions that are not. Mom, listen. Marla and I have been talking to some people. There is a place in Terre Haute. It is very nice. It is called Willow Creek. It is a residential setting. It has a garden. It is staffed. Marla's cousin Denise runs it. It would take a lot of pressure off both of you, Ruth said. How much does it cost, honey? Wallace said. Mom, do not worry about that. Marla and I have looked at the numbers. If we sell the farmhouse That pays for both of you for years. We have talked to a broker. He can move it fast. There is a buyer, Ruth said. There is already a buyer. Wallace said, yes. Ruth said, Wallace, the farmhouse is in your father's name. Wallace said, Mom, that is what I want to talk about Saturday. There is a form. It is called a durable power of attorney. Marla has a notary at her office. If Dad signs it, and if we file it, I can handle the sale for both of you, and you do not have to worry about any of it. Mom, are you crying? Mom, Ruth said, I am not crying, honey. I am listening, Wallace said. Mom, I love you. I am doing this because I love you. Dad is not the man he was. He bought an armory yesterday, Mom. He bought a condemned armory for $10. He is not okay. Willow Creek can help him. Denise can help him, Ruth said. Denise Kettering, Wallace said. How did you? Yes, Denise. Ruth said, Wallace, honey, I need to ask you one more question and I need you to tell me the truth. Wallace said, anything. Ruth said, whose key did you put on the hook in the mudroom on Monday night? Silence. Silence for 11 seconds. Wallace said, Mom, I have to call you back. He hung up. Ada Boone closed her notebook. She said, that is enough. That is more than enough. I am calling the Attorney General's office right now. Before we go inside the mudroom on Thursday morning at 2:47, before Miller lifts his head, and before Harold sends the one-word text, I want to ask you something. You have sat with Ruth's notebook. You have heard the 11-second silence. You know, now, what Wallace is. If you are the kind of person who thinks quiet, patient people deserve to be listened to, if you think Harold and Ruth Vance are worth the next 20 minutes of your evening. The small blue button under this video keeps stories like theirs finding the people who need them. That is all. Now, the dog is on his feet, and the back door is opening. Between you and me, if you were Ruth, sitting at that kitchen table Wednesday night, knowing what she now knew about her own son, would you spring the trap on Saturday, in front of him, in front of witnesses? Or would you have Ada Boone arrest him quietly on Friday morning and never look him in the eye again? There is no wrong answer, but I want you to hold your answer as we go into the last hour of this story. Because Harold and Ruth had to choose too. Daniel had written on July the 29th, 2003, the scariest thing in a firefight is not the noise, Dad. It is the one guy on the other side who is quiet. The loud ones are scared. The quiet one is coming. Harold did not sleep Wednesday night. He sat in the recliner in the front room, with Miller across his boots and a shotgun broken open across his lap. He was not going to shoot anybody. He was not going to have to. He had called Ada Boone at 9:52 at night, and Ada Boone had 2 deputies parked at the tree line in an unmarked truck from 10:15 Wednesday night to 6 in the morning, Sunday. At 2:47 in the morning, Thursday, Miller lifted his head. At 2:48, the mudroom camera tripped. Harold did not go into the mudroom. He picked up his phone. He texted the deputies. One word. Now, the mudroom footage, reviewed later that morning, showed a man Harold had never seen before. Late 30s, close-cropped hair, coveralls, a small tool bag. He came in through the back door using the key on the hook. He walked directly to Harold's desk in the front room, out of frame. The camera lost him for 11 minutes. He came back into the mudroom carrying Harold's desktop tower under one arm and Harold's file cabinet lockbox under the other. He walked toward the back door. He opened it. He stepped out into the porch light, and the deputies were already there. His name was Curtis Farrow. He was Marla's cousin, Denise's boyfriend. He had a prior for identity theft in 2019. He was under arrest by 3:04 in the morning. At 3:11, Ada Boone called Harold personally. She said, Harold, he was here for the deed and your DD form 214 and your bank statements. Marla told him what to take. Wallace gave him the key. This is a conspiracy of at least 4 people. I am going to the Attorney General in the morning with everything we have, and I am recommending charges by Friday. Do you still want to spring it at the Armory Saturday? Harold said yes. Ada said, why? We can pick him up tomorrow, Harold said, because Saturday is when he thinks he is winning. Ada, I want him to walk in believing he is about to close this. I want him to bring the power of attorney with him. I want him to put it on the table, and I want him to say in front of his mother and his sister exactly what he wants his father to sign. And then I want you, Ada said. Copy that, First Sergeant. Ruth wrote in the notebook Thursday morning at 6:14. 3 men now, Wallace, Marla, Curtis. Denise makes 4. This is not a family disagreement. This is a ring. Thursday afternoon at 4:33, Harold's phone rang. The screen said Clara. Harold answered, Clara Vance, aged 39, calling from Portland, Oregon for the first time in 4 years, said, Dad. Bethany texted me, Is it true? Harold said, Which part, honey? Clara said, All of it. Harold said, Yes. Clara said nothing for a long time. Then she said, Dad, I am not going to fly out. I cannot. I cannot be around Wallace, and I cannot be around Mum right now. We have too much history, and I will make it worse. But Dad, I want you to know, I did not know any of this. If I had known, Dad, if I had known, I would have. She did not finish the sentence. Harold said, Honey, it is all right. Clara said, No, it is not. But I called. That counts for something. Does it not? Harold said, Yes, Clara, it counts. They talked for 11 more minutes. She asked about Miller. She asked at the end whether her mother would come to the phone. Ruth took the phone. Ruth said, Clara, your father just told you it counts. He is right, it counts. Ruth handed the phone back to Harold. Harold said, Okay, Dad. She hung up. Ruth wrote in the notebook, Clara, middle place, not passed, not failed. A phone call. It counts. Harold rewrote the operation order's 4th part. Saturday, 10 in the morning, at the Armory. Ruth in her cardigan. Harold in his coat. Bethany in the truck bed with a recorder. Ada Boone and 2 deputies inside the Armory's motor bay, behind the door. The 2 suitcases on the ground. The Daniel letter, unopened, in Harold's inside coat pocket, Friday night. The farmhouse was quiet. Miller slept. Ruth could not. She sat at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning and took out the 6th letter, Daniel's last, dated August 14, 2003. She read the last paragraph. She had never read it aloud in 22 years. She practiced reading it aloud in a whisper. She practiced 6 times before she could say it without her voice breaking. Tomorrow, she would read it to her son Wallace, out loud, in front of witnesses. What Harold and Ruth Vance had walked into, without knowing it on the morning of October 3rd when Ruth stood in her sock feet in the mudroom, was not a family disappointment. It was not a story of an ungrateful son. It was, as Ada Boone would explain to Ruth in the Vance kitchen at 7:42 on Friday morning, a small, well-organized elder financial exploitation ring. And the state of Indiana's Attorney General's office would eventually charge 4 people in connection with it. The scheme worked in 5 parts. Part 1 was the identification of the mark. Marla Vance had worked, from 2018 to 2021, as an office manager at a private wealth firm in Indianapolis. In that job she had learned 2 things: which of her husband's aging relatives held real estate free and clear, and how the durable power of attorney form was worded, notarized, and filed in Indiana. The Vance farmhouse, 82 acres, paid off since 1996, most recently appraised at $412,000, had been on Marla's private mental list since 2019. Part 2 was the softening of the mark. Beginning in early 2023, Wallace increased his contact with his parents from once every 8 months to every 3 weeks. Marla began driving out with him. She began with a phone held at chest height, photographing the interior of the house. She began asking small questions. She began in August of 2023, asking Wallace's siblings whether they thought Harold and Ruth were, quote, still competent to make major decisions. Bethany told her the truth. Bethany was cut off. Clara was never even called. Part 3 was the placement facility. Willow Creek Residential in Terre Haute was operated by Denise Kettering, Marla's cousin, out of a converted duplex on a residential street. It was not licensed. It was not inspected. It housed, at the time of Ada Boone's Friday morning briefing, 4 elderly people, none of them there voluntarily. At a rate of $2,800 a month, per resident paid in cash by family members, who had signed power of attorney documents, very much like the one Marla had drafted for Harold. 2 of the 4 residents would, following the investigation, be removed by the state and placed in properly licensed care. One would be reunited with a daughter in Illinois, who had been told her mother was in a memory unit in Chicago. The 4th had no living family and would be placed by the state ombudsman. Part 4 was the property. Wallace had, on October 11th, met with a real estate broker in Indianapolis named Douglas Ains, and given him a verbal commitment on the Vance farmhouse. The buyer was a Shell Limited Liability Company registered in Delaware. The Attorney General would later trace it to a Marla cousin twice removed, offering $340,000 cash, $70,000 below appraisal, closing in 9 days, no inspection contingency. Wallace's cut, per an email he had unwisely sent from his work account, was to be $85,000. Part 5 was the paperwork. Marla had drafted a durable power of attorney, granting Wallace full financial authority over both Harold and Ruth, effective immediately, and a companion document improperly styled, granting Wallace the ability to place both parents in residential care at his discretion. A notary at Marla's current firm, a woman who owed Marla a favor, and would eventually accept a plea deal in exchange for testimony, was scheduled to notarize the document Saturday afternoon, after Wallace secured Harold's signature at the farmhouse. The document Wallace intended to bring to the Armory Saturday morning, and to the farmhouse Saturday afternoon, was the document that would have taken everything. The document Ada Boone intended to let him bring, and to lay on the table, was the document that would take everything from him. None of this was extraordinary. This is what elder financial exploitation looks like. It is not dramatic, it is not fast. It is a son who starts calling more often, a daughter-in-law with a phone, a cousin with a spare bedroom, and a form. It happens quietly, in the ordinary furniture of ordinary houses, and it happens to people who did not think it could happen to them. Ruth Vance had, in her notebook, 31 pages of things that did not sit right. The tragedy of most cases like this is that most people do not have 31 pages. They have a feeling, and they talk themselves out of it. Ruth did not talk herself out of it. That was the whole difference. On Friday at 8:19 in the morning, Ada Boone left the Vance farmhouse and drove to Indianapolis. She had a warrant for Marla's home computer, signed by 11. Marla's home computer, seized at 12:14 in a quiet knock, and consent while Marla was at work, contained a folder titled Tax Info Vance. Inside that folder were photographs of every letter Daniel Vance had written home in 2003. Underneath each photograph, in a word processing document, Marla had written a short paragraph analyzing the letter, for signs of what she called Harold's obsessive fixation on the deceased son, citing it as evidence of impaired judgment. The document was titled Talking Points, Guardianship Petition. Ruth would learn about this file at 4 in the afternoon Friday, and it would be the only moment in the whole story where she truly, physically, could not stand up. She sat down in the kitchen chair, and she put both hands flat on the table, and she stayed there for 6 minutes without speaking. Bethany brought her water. She did not drink it. She said, at 4:07, he was going to use Danny to take us. Bethany said, yes, Mama. Ruth said he was going to take Danny's letters and use them against your father. Bethany said, yes. Ruth stood up. She said, then Danny is going to be the one who ends it. Wallace called Friday night at 8:42. He wanted to confirm the Saturday visit. He said he and Marla would be up by 10 in the morning. He said he was bringing some paperwork. He said, Dad, this is going to be a good conversation. This is going to be a load-off. Trust me. Harold said, I trust you, son. He hung up. Ruth was watching him. She said, was that a lie? Harold said, Ruthie. That was the first thing I have said to that boy in 6 weeks, that I meant with my whole heart. I do not trust him. But he was my son long enough that I wanted to say those words out loud one more time before I stopped being able to say them. Ruth put her hand over his. At 10:11 on Friday night, Harold, Ruth, Bethany, Ada Boone, and 2 deputies met at the Armory to set the room. Ada had brought a fold-up table and 4 folding chairs. She had positioned them in the middle of the drill floor. She had placed, in the motor bay behind a rolling door, an unmarked truck with the 2 deputies inside. She had run through the choreography with Ruth and Harold 4 times. Wallace and Marla would arrive. They would see the 2 suitcases still by the door of the Armory. Bethany would put them there at 9:15 Saturday morning. They would see Ruth in her cardigan, and Harold in his coat. They would sit. They would open the folder. They would explain the paperwork. Harold would say, "Son, read it to me. Read the whole thing out loud." Wallace would read it. Ruth would ask her one question. Harold would say the sentence he had been rehearsing for 8 days. And then Ada Boone would come through the rolling door. The deputies walked the perimeter once. One of them, a young man named Terrell Briggs, stopped at the raised letters over the door. Hamilton County Armory, established 1912, and he said, "Sarge." "My grandfather drilled here," Harold said. "So did I, son." Terrell said, "He would be proud of what you are doing tonight." Harold said, "I hope so." At 11:47 Friday night, back at the farmhouse, Miller lifted his head again. Harold and Ruth were in bed. The deputies were parked at the tree line. Ada Boone had gone home to sleep. The mudroom camera had been reset for the weekend. There was no reason, at 11:47 on Friday night, for Miller to lift his head. Harold sat up. He listened. He heard faintly a car engine on the county road, slowing, and then not slowing, and then gone. He picked up his phone. He texted the deputies. "Something just passed. Slow, then gone." The deputy replied, "Silver sedan, female driver, continued north." We ran the plate. Marla Vance. Harold stared at the phone. Marla Vance had driven out to the farmhouse at 11:47 on Friday night, and slowed, and then not stopped, and then driven on. She had come, Harold understood, to see the lights. She had wanted to know whether her in-laws were home Friday night. She had wanted to know whether they were sleeping in the farmhouse, or at the Armory, or somewhere else. She had wanted to know whether, in the last 12 hours before Saturday morning, anything had changed. Harold set the phone down. He said aloud, "Into the dark, Ruthie." Ruth said, "I heard," Harold said. "She is not going to let him walk in cold Saturday." Ruth said, "No, she is not," Harold said. "She is going to call him at 7 Saturday morning, and she is going to tell him something is off, and she is going to tell him not to bring the paperwork." Ruth said, "Then we make her call not matter." Harold said, "How?" Ruth said. "We give her something to see before she calls." Ruth's plan was worked out between 11:52 Friday night and 1:14 Saturday morning, at the kitchen table, with Bethany on speakerphone from Bloomington. What Ruth proposed was small, elegant, and cruel. She proposed to give Marla Vance exactly what Marla Vance most wanted to see. A pair of frightened old people, alone, unwell, easy. At 6:12 on Saturday morning, Ruth Vance called Marla Vance from the farmhouse landline. She was recording the call. Ada Boone was in the kitchen listening. Ruth's voice was small. Ruth's voice was the voice of a woman who had not slept. Ruth was a Navy surgical nurse, and she had in her career faked composure through worse than this. Ruth said, "Marla, honey, I am sorry to call so early. Harold had a hard night. He is confused this morning. He keeps asking me where the Armory keys are. He keeps asking me if we can go back to the Armory. Marla, I do not know what to do." Marla paused. She said, Ruth, honey, it is okay. It is okay. Wallace and I are on our way up. We will be there in a couple of hours. Ruth, listen. Is he safe right now? Is he angry? Ruth said. He is sitting in the chair. He is very quiet. He said something about Danny this morning, Marla. He said Danny was in the mudroom. Silence. Ruth could hear, on the other end of the line, Marla covering the phone. She could hear Marla whispering to Wallace. She could hear Wallace ask, muffled, "Is she alone with him?" And Marla say, "Yes. Yes, she is alone. This is it. This is exactly what we needed." Marla came back on. She said, Ruth, honey, we are leaving now. We are leaving Indianapolis right now. We will be at the Armory by 10. You bring Dad. You bring him to the Armory. That is where he wants to be. Okay. Just get him in the truck. We will meet you there. And Ruth, bring Dad's ID and his checkbook. Just so we can talk through everything. Ruth said, okay, Marla said. Everything is going to be okay, Ruth. Marla is going to take care of everything. The call ended at 6:19. Ada Boone said, that is the second call today I would have paid money to hear, Ruth said. Ada, she just told Wallace to bring the paperwork. Ada said she did. Ruth sat down at the kitchen table. She said, I just used my son against my son. Bethany, who had been standing behind her mother in the doorway, said, Mama, he used Danny against Daddy first. Ruth put her head down on her arms on the table for 1 full minute. Then she sat up. She said, all right, let us get to the Armory. They arrived at 8:41. Bethany placed the 2 suitcases at the Armory door, the brown leather, the blue with the peeling Navy Nurse Corps sticker. Ruth pinned the poppy camera to her cardigan. Harold slid the folded copy of the operation order into his inside coat pocket, next to the 6th letter, Daniel's last, in its red rubber-banded stack. Ada Boone and the 2 deputies took position in the motor bay behind the rolling door. Ada had a body camera, so did Deputy Briggs. The State Attorney General's elder fraud investigator, a woman named Priya Chen, had arrived at 8:17 in a plain sedan and was seated inside a supply closet with a laptop connected to a small directional microphone aimed at the folding table. Everything Wallace said would be captured by 4 cameras and 3 microphones from 3 different chains of custody, all admissible. At 9:44, Ada Boone's radio crackled. The deputies at the county line had eyes on Wallace's black SUV coming north on Route 19. Marla was in the passenger seat. Wallace was driving. A briefcase was on the back seat. At 9:58, Ruth and Harold sat down at the folding table on the drill floor of the Armory. Bethany stood in the shadow of the loading bay, behind them, out of sight, but within hearing. Ruth's hands were shaking. Harold covered them with his. Harold said quietly, Ruthie, one more thing. Ruth said, what Harold said when you read Danny's last letter to him. Take your time. Danny wrote slow. Read it slow. Ruth said, okay. At 9:59, the black SUV came through the Armory gate. Harold whispered to Ruth, quoting Daniel's letter dated July 3rd, 2003. The only way to tell is who is asking you to sign, and how much they want it, and whether they let you read it first, Ruth said. He is going to want us to sign, Harold. Harold said, he is going to want us to sign very badly, Ruthie. Ruth said, okay. The SUV's engine cut off. Wallace got out first. He was wearing a wool overcoat almost identical to his father's. He was carrying the briefcase. Marla got out of the passenger side carrying 2 coffee cups from a drive-thru. She smiled when she saw Ruth. Wallace said, Mom. Dad. Oh, God. Mom, are you okay? He crossed the drill floor. He put his hand on his mother's shoulder. He looked at his father, and his face did the thing his face had done in 1998, when Ruth had asked him about the missing check. It softened. It emptied. It became the face of a boy. Harold said, sit down, son. Wallace sat down. Marla sat down. Marla set a coffee cup in front of Ruth. Ruth did not touch it. Marla said, Ruth, honey, how is he this morning? Ruth said, he is exactly the way he was yesterday, Marla. A small line appeared between Marla's eyebrows. Wallace said, Dad, I brought some paperwork. It is not a big deal. It is just some family paperwork that is going to make everything easier for you and Mum. Harold said, read it to me, son. Wallace said, Dad, I can just walk you through the... Harold said, read it to me, out loud. Read the whole thing. Wallace looked at Marla. Marla nodded. Wallace opened the briefcase. He took out 3 documents. He read the top one, the durable power of attorney, out loud, in a voice that got quieter as he went. He read the second one, the residential placement authorization, in a voice that had almost no breath in it. He set the 3rd document, the sale listing agreement for the farmhouse, face down on the table. Harold said, Read the third one too, son. Wallace turned it over. He read it. When he got to the buyer's name, the Delaware Shell Company, he stumbled on the pronunciation. When he got to the sale price, $340,000, he did not look up. He finished. He said, "Dad, this is just so. This is so I can help you and Mum. Denise has a beautiful room ready for you at Willow Creek. Marla and I already picked out," Ruth said. Wallace said, "Mom." Ruth said, "I want to read you something." She took the red rubber-banded stack of letters out of Harold's coat pocket. She untied the rubber band. She lifted the top letter, Daniel's last, dated August 14th, 2003. Marla went very still, Ruth said. "This is your brother's last letter. He wrote it 3 days before he died. He was 24 years old. I have not read the last paragraph out loud in 22 years. I am going to read it to you now." She unfolded the letter. Her hands were not shaking. She read, "Mum, Dad, I am writing this in the dark because we are not supposed to have lights on tonight. I do not have much time and I do not have much light, so I am going to say the thing I have been trying to say for 6 months in a letter and have not been able to. I want you to know I am not afraid. I am tired. There is a difference, and I want you to know I know the difference. If this is my last letter, and it might not be, I hope it is not. But if it is, I want you to know 3 things. 1. I love you both more than I have words for, and I am sorry I did not say it more. 2. Look after each other. That is the whole job. That is the only job. 3. And Dad, this one is for you. If anything ever happens to me, do not let Wallace run the family. He is not built for it. He is not a bad kid. He is just a scared kid who thinks money is love. He will try to run things because Bethany will not push him out of the way, and Clara will be too far. Do not let him, Dad. Not because he will steal from you. He will not mean to. But because he will turn you into a problem to solve, and you and Mom are not a problem to solve. You are the people who made me. Please do not let him make you into paperwork. I love you both. I have to go. Somebody is calling my name. Danny. Ruth lowered the letter. Wallace was crying. He was crying the way a 48-year-old man cries when he has just heard, in his own mother's voice, in his dead brother's words, the exact diagnosis of what he has become. He was making no sound. His shoulders were shaking. Marla was staring at him. Marla was staring at him, and her face was changing. Harold said quietly, "Son, look at me." Wallace looked up. Harold said, "Did you photograph these letters in our house at 4 in the morning on the 19th of October to use them against me in a guardianship petition?" Wallace said, "Dad," Harold said, "Yes or no, son?" Wallace said, "Yes." The rolling door at the back of the drill floor rolled up. Ada Boone walked through. Deputy Briggs walked behind her. Priya Chen from the State Attorney General's office walked in from the supply closet on the left. Bethany stepped out of the shadow of the loading bay on the right. Ada Boone said, "Wallace Vance, Marla Vance, you are both under arrest. You have the right to remain silent." Marla was silent all the way to the sheriff's cruiser. Marla did not look at Ruth. Marla did not look at Harold. Marla would, 4 months later, take a plea agreement that included 18 months of incarceration, 5 years of probation, mandatory restitution, and a permanent bar from any position involving fiduciary responsibility for elders. Wallace did not stop crying until they put him in the back of the second cruiser. Just before Deputy Briggs closed the door, Wallace looked at his father one time. He said, "Dad." Harold walked over to the cruiser. He put one hand on the roof. He leaned down to the open window. He said, "Son." Wallace said, "Dad, I." Harold said, "No, son, not now." He paused. He said, "Danny told me not to let you turn us into paperwork. I did not let you. That is the only thing I did today, son. That is the only thing I have to say to you today." He straightened up. He tapped the roof of the cruiser twice with the palm of his hand, the old cavalry sign for "Move Out," and Deputy Briggs pulled away. Ruth was standing at the door of the Armory. Bethany was next to her, holding her hand. The 2 suitcases were on the ground between them. Miller was sitting at Ruth's feet. Harold walked back across the drill floor. He put his arm around his wife's shoulders. She put her arm around his waist. They stood, backs to the road, facing the inside of the armory, the rusted trusses, the broken windows, the ivy pushing through. And for the first time in 7 weeks, since October 3rd at 2:14 in the afternoon, when Ruth had heard Marla in the kitchen, Harold Vance's hands were not shaking. Ruth said, "Harold, what do we do now?" Harold said, "Now we build it." Ruth said, "Build what?" Harold said, "What Danny said. Look after each other, that is the whole job." Ruth looked at the drill floor. She looked at the ivy. She looked at the 12 rooms that would in 18 months be 12 beds. She looked at the ordnance storage room that would become a chapel. She looked at the motor bay that would become a workshop. She said, "Okay, Harold." Bethany, still holding her mother's hand, said, "Where do we start, Daddy?" Harold said, "Honey, we start by unpacking the suitcases." He looked down at them, he said. "And then we start by never letting them stay empty again." The armory took 18 months to open. Harold hired a general contractor from Noblesville named Etta Wren, a 59-year-old former combat engineer, who did the asbestos remediation herself with a licensed crew and then did the framing with 3 of her nephews. The pension arrears, $71,400, paid for the remediation and the roof. The laddered certificates of deposit, $214,880, paid for the framing, the plumbing, the electrical, the chapel windows, and the workshop equipment. When the money ran short in month 14, Bethany opened a community fund and raised $38,000 in 6 weeks from a county that had watched 2 of its veterans buy a ruin for $10 and decided, without being asked, that it wanted to help finish what they had started. The farmhouse became the intake building. It was awarded to Harold and Ruth in a civil restitution judgment against Wallace and Marla. And Ruth, who had lived in it for 46 years, one time by herself, and then turned it over to the Daniel E. Vance House Foundation. She said she could not sleep in it anymore. She said the mudroom was ruined for her. She said she would rather live at the Armory. The caretaker's quarters at the Armory were 2 rooms on the 2nd floor of the administrative wing, with a window that looked out onto the field where Harold had drilled in 1968. Harold and Ruth moved in on the 1st day of April. Miller came with them. Miller lived another 2 years. He is buried under the maple in what used to be the ordnance yard. Bethany runs the intake office. She drives up from Bloomington 3 days a week. Her teenage son, Daniel's namesake nephew, mows the field in the summer. Clara has visited twice, once for the ribbon cutting, once for Christmas. It is not the whole distance closed, but it is a phone call every Sunday now, and a plane ticket paid for by Harold twice a year. Ruth calls this the Middle Place Holding. The Daniel E. Vance House opened on the 16th of October, 2025, 2 years and 1 week after Ruth stood in her sock feet in the mudroom. 12 rooms. A chapel from the old ammunition storage. A workshop from the motor bay. An intake office in the front of the administrative wing. A garden in the yard where Ruth planted, on the day they broke ground, a row of yellow chrysanthemums, Daniel's favorite, because he had brought them home for her once, at 15, from a homecoming dance he had not gone to. The first 3 residents were combat veterans between the ages of 59 and 72, none of whom had a family to go home to. The 4th resident was a woman. The 5th was a woman. 2 of the 12 rooms are, by policy of the foundation, reserved for elderly people who have been the victims of the same kind of scheme Harold and Ruth walked out of. Sheriff Ada Boone sits on the board. Priya Chen from the State Attorney General's office sits on the board. Etta Wren, the contractor, sits on the board. Harold and Ruth are the only 2 board members who receive no stipend and do not vote. Wallace served 14 months. He wrote his parents a letter every week for the first 6 months, and Ruth kept them, unopened, in a drawer. In April of the 2nd year she opened the first one. In May she opened the second. She has not at the time of this story opened the rest. She has not decided yet whether she will. Ruth says forgiveness is a slow verb. In the intake hall of the Daniel E. Vance house, between 2 reading chairs by the front window, there is a low table. The table is not a table. It has 2 vintage suitcases, laid flat, one on top of the other. The bottom one is brown leather with a brass clasp that Harold bought at a post exchange in Long Bin in 1971. The top one is blue, with a Navy Nurse Corps sticker peeling near the handle. On top of the blue suitcase, there is a lamp and a coaster, and a Bible that has never been opened, and on most weekdays, a mug of black coffee that Harold sets down while he reads the paper. The suitcases are empty. They have been empty since the morning of October 24th, 2023, when Ruth Vance packed a change of underclothes for 2 and a Purple Heart in a velvet box and 6 letters bound in a red rubber band, and stood in front of a rusted armory in a light grey cardigan and let the town of Cicero, Indiana, believe she had lost everything. They are still empty. Harold and Ruth have not put anything back inside them. Ruth says she does not need to. Ruth says the point of empty suitcases is that they are ready. On the second Saturday of every month, veterans arrive at the intake hall of the Daniel E. Vance house for a room. Some of them come with duffel bags. Some of them come with grocery sacks. Some of them come with nothing at all. Ruth greets them at the door in her light grey cardigan. Harold stands behind her, one hand on the small of her back. Miller is no longer at their feet, but there is a young shepherd named Ellery now who is learning the job. Ruth walks each new arrival to the intake table by the window. She sits them down in one of the 2 reading chairs. She sets a mug of coffee on the blue suitcase. She says, always the same 6 words. She says, "You are not a problem to solve." That is Daniel's line. She says it every time. And outside, past the intake window, the raised letters over the front door of the Armory still read what they have read for 113 years. Hamilton County Armory, established 1912. Because Harold would not let the county take them down. He said the letters had been there before he was born. He said they would be there after he was gone. He said the only thing that had ever changed about that building was who was inside it. That, he said, was the whole story.